Why monitor prices vary by 10 times. 3 things genuinely justify a higher price: panel technology, refresh rate, and resolution. Panel technology determines contrast, color accuracy, and response time. Refresh rate determines how smoothly motion appears. Resolution determines how much information fits on screen. 3 things inflate price without improving your experience: brand name, aesthetics, and the word gaming in the product title. A monitor with aggressive angular styling and RGB lighting costs more than the same panel in a plain housing. The panel is identical. The experience is identical. Gaming as a label adds roughly $50 to $150 to a monitor without changing the hardware, because gaming monitors sell to people who buy on features lists rather than measured performance. One of the most consistent findings in monitor review communities: the plain office version of a popular gaming panel regularly outperforms its gaming sibling in input lag measurements, because gaming models ship with more aggressive default settings that introduce artifacts. $200. At $200 in 2026, you receive a 24 to 27-inch IPS panel, 1080p resolution, typically 75 Hz refresh rate, and color accuracy that is acceptable but not measured. The panel manufacturers at this tier, sourced primarily from BOE and AUO, produce perfectly functional displays. The compromises are specific and worth naming. 75 Hz is the lowest refresh rate worth buying in 2026. 60 Hz panels exist at this price but should be avoided. The difference between 60 Hz and 75 Hz is small. The difference between 75 Hz and 144 Hz, which starts one tier up, is large enough that most people notice it within minutes. 1080p on a 27-inch screen produces roughly 81 pixels per inch. At normal desk viewing distance, individual pixels become visible in text and fine details. The same resolution on a 24-inch screen, 92 pixels per inch, is meaningfully sharper. If your budget is $200 and you want 1080p, choose 24 inches over 27. Color accuracy at this price tier is factory average. The panel's colors are in the right neighborhood, but not tuned. For most content, this is unnoticeable. For photographs, design work, or anything where the color on screen needs to represent a real-world color, it is not sufficient. The correct use case for $200, a second monitor on a desk, a screen for a family member who browses and watches video, or a display for a computer that cannot push more than 75 frames per second anyway. The wrong use case: anyone doing color-sensitive work, anyone gaming with a GPU capable of above 75 frames per second, or anyone who will spend 8 or more hours a day looking at it. At $200, you are buying a functional screen. You are not buying the right screen for most of the tasks people spend the most time doing. $300. The tier most people skip and regret. The price-to-performance ratio of PC monitors peaks at $300. At this price in 2026, 1440p resolution appears across multiple reputable models. 144 Hz becomes the standard rather than the exception, and IPS panels with genuine color accuracy, not just acceptable color, are available. The monitors in this range now perform identically to $600 monitors from 2022. Panel technology does not change year to year. The same physical panel technology that was premium 3 years ago has migrated down the price ladder. What $300 gets you in 2026 would have required $550 in 2022. Most people skip this tier because the jump from $200 to $300 feels large, while the jump from $200 to $500 feels more justifiable for a premium product. The psychology is backwards. The $300 monitor is frequently the better purchase. The specific difference 1440p makes over 1080p at 27 inches. On a 1080p 27-inch panel, you are viewing roughly 81 pixels per inch. On a 1440p 27-inch panel, you are viewing 108 pixels per inch. The jump is visible at normal viewing distances without effort. Text is sharper. The icons, the fine details in games, the difference between an in-focus and out-of-focus image in a photo, all of these are more clearly rendered. The practical consequence: a 1080p 27-inch monitor makes Windows UI elements look slightly soft. A 1440p 27-inch monitor does not. The specific combination to look for at this tier: 27-inch, 1440p, 144 Hz minimum, IPS panel. That combination covers the majority of computing tasks better than anything in the tier below, and most things in the tier above. $400 to $500. At $400 to $500, refresh rates climb to 165 Hz and 240 Hz, and 1440p at high refresh rates combined in the same panel. This is the mainstream gaming sweet spot for 2026. 1440p resolution is sharp enough at 27 inches that individual pixels disappear, and 144 to 165 Hz is fast enough that motion appears smooth in every genre. The measurable question about 240 Hz. Most human eyes stop perceiving meaningful improvement in smoothness somewhere between 144 Hz and 240 Hz under normal viewing conditions. The difference between 60 Hz and 144 Hz is immediately obvious to almost everyone. The difference between 144 Hz and 240 Hz is perceivable by some people in direct comparison. The difference between 240 Hz and 360 Hz is perceivable only by people with extremely specific visual sensitivity under very specific conditions. If your GPU cannot consistently deliver 200 or more frames per second in the games you play, the 240 Hz panel is running at 144 Hz or lower most of the time. You paid for 240 Hz and received 144 Hz. At this tier, the IPS versus VA debate also matters more than at lower prices. VA panels offer better contrast. Blacks appear darker because the panel technology physically blocks more light from passing through. A VA panel's native contrast ratio is typically 3000 to 1 to 5000 to 1. An IPS panel's native contrast ratio is typically 1000 to 1 to 1300 to 1. For watching dark movies, the VA advantage is visible, but VA panels at $400 consistently show a problem called smearing or dark level ghosting on fast-moving content that IPS panels do not. The specific mechanism, VA pixels take longer to transition from very dark colors than from lighter ones. When a dark object moves quickly against a dark background, the trailing pixels don't fully transition in time, creating a visible smear. Review sites measure this, but frequently underweight it in their final verdicts because the test is done in controlled conditions. In real gaming, dark corridors, night environments, shadows, VA ghosting appears constantly. For anyone gaming in titles with fast movement and dark scenes, VA ghosting at this price tier will be visible every session, unless contrast is your primary requirement and you primarily watch video or static content. IPS is the correct choice at $400 to $500, $600 to $700. The number that separates a display a professional can trust from one they cannot is delta E. Delta E measures how far a displayed color deviates from the color that was intended. A delta E below 2 means the error is invisible to the human eye under controlled conditions. A delta E above 3 means colors on screen do not accurately represent colors in the real world. What you see is not what your client will see, not what prints, not what appears on a calibrated display. At $600 to $700, factory-calibrated panels with delta E below 2 become standard. These monitors ship with a printed calibration certificate, a document showing the measured delta E values for the specific panel you received, not an average. Wide color gamut coverage, 99% sRGB and DCI-P3 coverage also becomes accessible at this tier. The DCI-P3 color space is the standard for digital cinema. A graphic designer, photographer, or video editor working on a $300 monitor is working with color values they cannot see accurately. The work looks correct on their screen and incorrect on every calibrated display it's viewed on. At $600 to $700, this problem is solved. $800 to $1,000. OLED monitors reached this price tier meaningfully in 2024 and became genuinely competitive by 2025. With sales growing 92% year over year. The specific advantage of OLED that specs cannot fully communicate: contrast. An IPS panel creates black by blocking the backlight. It blocks most of the light. Black on an IPS panel is dark gray, measurably, photographably dark gray. An OLED panel creates black by turning the pixel off entirely. True black. Infinite contrast ratio. The visual difference in a dark room is immediately, permanently obvious to anyone who has seen both side by side. OLED response times measure at 0.03 milliseconds gray to gray, so fast that motion-related blur from panel response is effectively eliminated. The burn-in question. long-term testing over 24 months and more than 6,000 hours under worst-case conditions. Static productivity content 8 hours a day shows gradual but noticeable degradation after roughly 2 to 3 years. For gaming primary use, where content is dynamic, burn-in is not a meaningful concern. For productivity primary use with static taskbars and application layouts, burn-in becomes visible after 2 to 3 years under intensive use. The panel protection features built into 2025 and 2026 OLED monitors, pixel shift, automatic refresh cycles, static element brightness reduction slow this progression significantly. The burn-in risk is real. It is also specific to usage patterns most users do not have. $1,000 to $1,500. At $1,000 to $1,500, 27-inch 4K at high refresh rates, 144 Hz and above, becomes accessible. This combination required $2,000 or more 2 years ago. Ultra-wide panels, 34-inch 3440 by 1440 resolution, also occupy this tier. The productivity argument for ultra-wide. A single 34-inch ultra-wide provides roughly the same horizontal workspace as two 24-inch monitors placed side by side, without the bezel in the middle and the desk space of two monitor stands. The gaming argument against ultra-wide that ultra-wide marketing never mentions. Many competitive multiplayer games do not support ultra-wide resolutions, or gain a competitive disadvantage in ultra-wide by making the field of view distorted. Some games have ultra-wide support blocked in competitive modes, specifically because wider field of view creates an unfair advantage. If you game in any title with active ranked modes, verify ultra-wide support before purchasing. $1,500 to $2,000. The specification ceiling and its honest value. At $1,500 to $2,000, mini-LED backlighting with thousands of local dimming zones enters. Mini-LED places thousands of tiny LEDs behind the panel. A 2024-era premium mini-LED monitor may have 1,000 to 2,000 individual dimming zones, each controlled independently. This allows the backlight to dim precisely behind dark areas of the screen while remaining bright behind bright areas. The result closes the gap between IPS and OLED contrast meaningfully. A standard IPS panel has one to a few backlight zones. When dark content appears on screen, the entire backlight dims, making the bright elements dimmer too. This is visible as a halo or blooming effect around bright objects on a dark background. A white moon against a black sky glows with a visible gray circle around it. A 2000-zone mini-LED panel eliminates most of that blooming, because the dark areas and bright areas are controlled independently. Peak brightness at this tier exceeds 1000 nits for HDR content on panels with VISA display, HDR 1000 certification. The honest limitation, the content that justifies this specification, barely exists in 2026. HDR mastered video on streaming platforms is frequently mastered for 400 to 600 nit displays because that covers the majority of consumer screens. HDR in PC games is inconsistently implemented. Many games claim HDR support while delivering an effect that looks worse than disabled HDR on a well-calibrated SDR panel. A $700 OLED monitor will frequently look better for most content than a $1,500 mini-LED monitor because the content on screen was not made for the mini-LED's capabilities. The $1,500 to $2,000 tier is correct for specific professional workflows. HDR grading, high brightness photography editing, content that genuinely requires the specification. For general use, the law of diminishing returns here is steep and unambiguous. Input lag versus response time. The number nobody shows you. Response time and input lag are two different measurements that are consistently confused. Response time measures how fast a pixel transitions between colors. Input lag measures how long the monitor takes to process and display a signal after it arrives from your computer. A monitor with a 1 millisecond response time and 20 millisecond input lag will feel slower and less responsive than a monitor with 4 millisecond response time and 5 millisecond input lag. Input lag is almost never listed prominently in monitor marketing. Response time is always listed prominently. The reason? Response time is a hardware measurement of the panel. Input lag is affected by the monitor's internal processing, the image enhancement features, the HDR processing, The gaming mode toggles. When you enable HDR processing, game mode features, or certain refresh rate enhancements, input lag typically increases. The setting to change on every monitor immediately after setup, the response time or overdrive preset. Most monitors ship with this set to fastest or extreme. This setting overdrives the pixel transition to hit the advertised response time and produces a visible artifact called inverse ghosting or overshoot, where bright halos appear behind moving objects. Set the overdrive preset one level below maximum, typically fast or normal, and the ghosting disappears without meaningful loss of response time. This single setting change improves the visual quality of motion on most monitors without any hardware change. Most people never touch it. The framework that survives any specific model recommendation. The specifications that will remain valid regardless of which models exist when you read this. At any budget, prioritize IPS panel technology over VA unless contrast is your primary requirement. Prioritize 1440p over 1080p for any screen 25 inches or larger. Prioritize 144Hz minimum over higher refresh rates if your GPU cannot reach 200 frames per second consistently. At $600 and above, look for factory calibration with a printed Delta E certificate if color accuracy matters to your work. At $800 and above, consider OLED if your primary use is gaming or media consumption, and your usage pattern is dynamic rather than static. Ignore any marketing language that includes the word gaming without a specification attached. Check input lag measurements from hardware review sites. Artings.com and Monitors Unboxed publish these, not manufacturer spec sheets. Refresh rate appears in every monitor spec sheet and is misunderstood by most buyers. Every type of monitor refresh rate explained is on screen right now.